Welcome back to installing a SQL Server clustered instance. As you can see, our installation has gone successfully. We've got green check marks next to all the features that we've installed, which is good, because that's what we want to see. Now, our clustered installation is not complete. We've only installed SQL Server on one node of the cluster. We still have a second node of the cluster that we have to deal with. Let's go ahead and jump back into the slides. Then we'll take a look at another demonstration on how to install that second node. So to do the installation on the second node, or any additional nodes that you're going to install, if you're going to go for a 3 or more node cluster, you start by simply running setup.exe as normal. When you get to the installation menu, instead of clicking to install a new failover cluster instance, you're going to click the Add Additional Node to a Cluster option. This is going to run you through a much shorter wizard that's going to give you a lot of information already. It doesn't need to ask for a whole lot because it's going to know a lot of the stuff just based on the installation on the previous machines. Let's go ahead and take a look at the demo of how to do this installation so we can see exactly what's going to happen. So this is the machine we've already installed. So we're just going to go ahead and switch over to our second machine, which is SQL 01B. So you see here, we've got the SQL Server Installation Center up, and I've got the installation menu already selected. Now, on the previous machine, we clicked this new SQL Server failover cluster installation. But we're not going to click that this time because we don't want to do a new instance within the cluster. We simply want to add a node to the existing instance. For example, the instance we have already is the default instance. If we want to add a new instance called Instance 1, we would then click the new SQL Server failover cluster installation, because that would be a new installation within this cluster. But in this case, we don't want to do that. We want to go ahead and add a node to our existing failover SQL Server installation. So we're going to go ahead and click the Add Node to a SQL Server failover cluster option. And when the wizard comes up, we're going to go ahead and run through that wizard. Now, a lot of the screens you're going to see are going to look very, very familiar. There's going to be one or two that are different, but for the most part, this is going to look exactly like the traditional installer wizard, just with a lot less screens. First thing we do is a quick rule check to make sure that we're ready to install SQL Server 2012 on this machine. And we can see that these rules are the exact same rules that we saw before. Once that rule check passes, just go ahead and click OK, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next part of the wizard. So on this next screen, we can either enter our product key or select the edition we're going to use. Again, we're going to be using the Evaluation Edition. Now, when installing a failover cluster, the editions have to match between the instances. You can't use Enterprise Edition on one node and Standard on another. They've got to be the exact same edition. So we're going to use Evaluation Edition because that's what we used on the first node. Go ahead and click Next. Agree to the license terms. Just like before, click the Send Feature Usage Data to Microsoft option if you're allowed to do that and if you're interested in doing that. So just like before, we don't have any internet access on this machine, so we're going to go ahead and uncheck that checkbox and then click Next. SQL Server is now going to install the setup files so that we can proceed with the installation. Once that part of the wizard is completed, the next wizard will pop up on the screen. As you can see, this wizard has a lot less pages available on it than the normal installation wizard. So we can click the Show Details to go through the rule check, and you can see the same warnings of popping up on this node as they were on the previous node. Because we've seen all these errors on the previous node, we can go ahead and just simply skip these errors and skip checking what they are, since we're well aware of what all these problems are. Go ahead and click Next. The next screen is asking us what instance we want to install this as within this cluster. Now, how the installer knows what these options are is because this machine is already a member of the cluster. So it's simply querying the cluster that this machine is a part of to figure out what instances are available on it that it doesn't already have installed. So we can see that there's a drop-down menu, which we'd be able to select between the different instances if there were multiple instances installed. Since we just have the one instance, that's the only option on the list. So we simply select the instance we want. We can see which machine we're on in case we've forgotten. And we can see a list of options available here to see what exactly has been installed and what nodes it's been installed on. If we were installing on SQL 01C, for example, and had already done A and B, SQL 01A and SQL 01B would be listed here in the Nodes option in a comma-separated list. If we have multiple instances, they'll all be listed here as well with all the nodes that they've been installed on. As you get into larger and larger clusters with more and more instances installed on them, this gets very important to see how everything's installed so you know exactly what you're installing where. We're going to go ahead and click Next since we've selected the instance that we want to use. We can see the network information here for our specific instance. Now the reason we're seeing this again is because if this was a multi-subnet cluster, we would see multiple lines of information here so that we can get those all set up. Because we're only using a single subnet and a single site, we don't have to worry about that. So we're going to go ahead and just click Next. We get to the service accounts page, and as you can see here, the usernames are already grayed out, so you can't change the username the account is run under. That's because you need to be using the same user account on all your nodes. So we're just going to go ahead and put the password in here, and then hit Next. Once we get through the password screen, we get to the error reporting screen. Like always, you can opt to send this information to Microsoft, or you can choose not to. Go ahead and click Next. We're now going to do a rules check to make sure that we can actually add the node we want to add. So the first check there is the number of nodes supported for this edition. That's because Standard Edition only supports 2 nodes for a clustered instance, whereas Enterprise Edition supports a much larger number. We're going to make sure we don't have the FAT32 file system, that the cluster resource DLL is not pending an update before it restarts, and that we don't have the SQL Server services already installed on this machine. We go ahead and click Next, and we're ready to add the node. We see the configuration file listed below, and we can actually use this configuration file to install additional nodes if we're going to have additional nodes in this cluster. So if we're going to have, for example, a 5-node cluster, we only really need to do 2 of the nodes by hand. At that point, we can take the configuration file for the second node that we did and use that configuration file to do an unintended install on all the remaining nodes of the cluster. This will greatly speed up the process of installing SQL Server on all 5 of the nodes. Let's go ahead and click Install, and that's going to go ahead and start the process. Now, as you can imagine, because we have to do each node individually, installing SQL Server on a large multi-node cluster gets very, very time-consuming very, very quickly. For example, if you've got a 16-node cluster and you're installing 15 instances on that node, you're doing 240 installations of the SQL Server database engine on those machines. That's a lot of running through the installer and going through the process, especially considering you can only run 1 installation at a time for each instance. So if I'm doing a 5-node install, and I'm installing just 1 instance on that 5-node cluster right now, I have to do all 5 installations in serial. I cannot do multiples at the same time. And that's because the cluster database has to be locked while the installation process is being run through. So if we're doing a large 16-node cluster with 15 instances on it, and we're doing 240 installations, each installation takes, we'll say, an hour to get through the process. Just to give ourselves a little breathing room, that's 240 hours of work, or 30 days just to install the SQL Server product. So if we can automate a lot of that and let a lot of things run overnight, maybe use PowerShell to speed this process up so that things can run throughout the night, suddenly this gets a lot faster. Instead of taking 30 days, assuming it all has to run in serial, we might be able to get it down to 10 days. Now, once you are doing multi-instance, multi-node installations, there are ways to run some of it in parallel, but it's very, very complex to get set up. I don't want to dive into that too much, but it is possible to help reduce that number a little bit, and that may get it down to just a couple of days of actually installing SQL to get the cluster up and running and ready to go. We're going to go ahead and finish this installation demonstration and complete the slide deck during our next video.